All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of BDU Shooting Academy. In episode 3, we're going to be covering what you're going to do with this. It's not this, it's something else. In this episode, we're going to cover what you need to do with your finger to control and manipulate the trigger with efficiency. So we're going to talk about finger placement, we're going to talk about prepping the trigger, how to reset the trigger, and how to troubleshoot maybe a few things that you might be seeing when you're shooting and missing. So trigger control is quite important when you're trying to be as accurately shooting as possible. So there's a lot of little things here and there that you can do to make it even better, but for right now, we're just going to show you the basics on how to pull a trigger. You'll hear a lot of instructors use certain terms like pull the trigger straight back. I really don't understand how you're supposed to pull the trigger in any other way because the trigger goes straight back anyway. So it's kind of a given, but I digress. So whenever you're pulling the trigger, what you want to do is to think about having complete control over the pressure of the trigger. That means instead of karate chopping it with your finger like that, you're going to try to pull the trigger straight back. See what I did there? Pull the trigger with even pressure all the way back until you hear the click. So with finger placement, I found that it's not as important if you have it on the pad or the crook of your finger or the end of your fingertip. You can shoot the gun like this and still hit where you're aiming at if you just have proper trigger control. We're going to give you the meat and potatoes of how to pull a trigger. So finger placement, let's just say it's the pad of your first digit on your trigger finger. So a good exercise that you can try to do to get used to pulling on this trigger, one, you want to make sure that the gun is completely empty, but two, that you're aiming it at a safe direction. But what you're going to do is you're going to get your finger onto the trigger. You're going to slowly pull it back, just with enough pressure for it to creep just a little bit until you get to the hard wall of the trigger, wherever that is on your gun. And then once you get there, you're just going to add a little bit more pressure, a little bit more pressure, a little bit more pressure, and then bang. Okay? So you do that a few times. Get used to the way that your trigger pulls, how much weight it has. One thing to consider is that these triggers, the heaviest trigger I've ever pulled is like a 12-pound double action trigger. So there's really no reason for you to use any more than what your trigger actually needs. So let's say you have a 3.5-pound trigger and you're trying to pull it with 7 pounds worth of force. Things are going to happen. The gun's going to move and shift and you're going to miss what you're actually shooting at. So learn to use just enough pressure for you to pull that trigger and to let it break the sear or the striker or whatever your gun has in order to break the shot. So again, the best way to explain it is you're just adding pressure, enough pressure for the trigger to move, enough to break the shot. So from here, you're just going to pull it straight back and then bang. Right back and then bang. Okay? Do that a couple times, get used to the way that it feels, and you'll be perfectly fine. Once you start shooting, you'll see what I mean by when you're pulling that trigger with even pressure, how easy it is to isolate your trigger finger and to not affect you pulling the trigger with your whole hand. Because if you try to do that, when you try to squeeze the trigger with your whole hand because you're trying to manage the recoil that's about to happen, the gun shifts and moves because all that stuff is just tensing up. But if you're able to pull the trigger with an isolated finger, there's not a lot of movement. So it's going to be a lot easier for you to stay on target and actually shoot what you're aiming at. So there are a lot of things that you can do to troubleshoot your trigger pulls if you happen to be missing. Okay, so if you happen to be right-handed, usually what I see with students is that if they are missing and they're wondering why they can't hit what they're aiming, it's because they're probably shooting low and left, and a little bit opposite, or the complete opposite for left-handers. They're going to shoot low and right, because what's happening is when they're pulling the trigger, they're squeezing so hard that they're pushing the gun in that certain direction. There are other things that if it was going up and to the right and up and to the left for a right-hander, you might not have enough grip pressure or a grip at all on your right hand if you're pulling it up and to the right. If you're up and to the left, that means you really don't have that much grip on your support hand as a right-hander, and vice versa for lefts. So if you're seeing yourself like your shots are drifting a certain way, maybe fix your grip, try changing the way that you're pulling the trigger, and experiment a few things. And it's going to be different for everybody's hand, what they're doing, how they're applying pressure to the trigger finger. But for the most part, in order to shoot at something, it doesn't matter how far it is or how much finger you have into the trigger, as long as you're able to pull that trigger with even pressure all the way back, or you're going to hit where you're aiming at. So just to recap, make sure that you're giving yourself enough opportunity to apply pressure with just using your trigger finger. Try to maybe like relax the palm of your trigger hand, and it'll give you a little bit more mobility with this. And in time, you'll be able to apply a little bit more pressure with your trigger hand to be able to still isolate that trigger finger. So try a couple things, see what works for you, but keep the fundamentals pretty much the same. In episode 4, we'll be covering recoil management and what you can do to make that a little bit easier of a task. So we'll see you then.